You might think pirates spent most of their time swashbuckling, drinking rum and shouting "air" at passing ships, but their biggest enemy wasn't the British Navy or rival buccaneers. It was something far less glamorous and a heck of a lot messier. Surgery. Yeah, picture this. Instead of Hollywood's romantic cutthroat battling swords and cannonballs, real pirates were often hacking away at wounds during naval battles with nothing more than a rusty dagger, poor lighting, and a whole lot of grit. Let me tell you something wild about how pirates performed surgery right there on deck, because the solutions they came up with, well, they were part genius, part mad science, and fully horrifying. And trust me, you'll never look at a pirate movie the same way again. Now, the real kicker is that in those close-quarter naval fights, getting injured was basically as likely as a parrot pooping on your shoulder. Pirates faced serious gashes, broken bones, and infections that could kill faster than a broadside cannon blast. And yet, there was no neat little operating room or sanitized tools. Instead, they had to figure it out on the fly, with blood, guts, and the salty sea air all around them. For a starting point, consider a typical pirate crew on a mid-1700s vessel, say, around 100 men packed into a ship barely larger than a small hotel. During battle, wound rates were catastrophic. Historians estimate that as many as 60 to 70% of crew members would suffer some form of injury. And without prompt treatment, death was practically guaranteed within 24 to 48 hours if the wound became septic. Dead men tell no tales, right? So, what did pirates do when one of their own was bleeding like a sliced watermelon on the deck? The first major problem was the tools, or lack thereof. Pirate surgeons might have had a single scalpel or a bayonet lying around, but these weren't sterilized in any modern sense. In fact, the idea of sterilization was centuries away. Antiseptic practices wouldn't become widespread until the mid-19th century. Pirates had to make do with whatever they had: dull knives, broken glass, or even sharpened shards of bone. Bad idea. Really bad idea if you ask modern medicine. There's a famous story from 1717, when Pirate Henry Avery's flagship, the Fancy, was involved in a brutal fight near the Indian Ocean. When the ship's carpenter got struck by a musket ball in the shoulder, the ship's surgeon had to dig it out with a pocket knife while the battle raged on. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well at first. The carpenter's wound got infected, think a nasty, oozing mess, and the surgeon ended up having to amputate the arm just above the elbow using a saw that was supposed to shape wood. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. But here's where it gets interesting. Pirates figured out some clever solutions to what sounds like impossible problems. Because nothing says professional surgical team like a bunch of seafaring criminals performing field operations in seawater-soaked sails. First, they realized that the salty ocean water actually slowed some bacterial growth, so they would rinse wounds in buckets of seawater, pretty much their version of a water treatment plant, if you squint. While not exactly sanitary by today's standards, that salt content, roughly 3.5% in seawater, did help to reduce infection rates slightly, cutting down cases that might otherwise have been fatal. Pirates didn't know about microbes or pathogens, of course, but they noticed that wounds rinsed with salty water fared better than those just wrapped in grimy cloth. So while it's not exactly the Mayo Clinic, it was better than nothing. But then came the thorny issue of pain. Can you imagine having your arm sawed off while someone is trying not to lose half the ship in cannon fire? Pirates had two main methods to handle this: either sheer madness or large quantities of rum. I mean, rum was basically pirate anesthetic, their version of modern painkillers. Studies of pirate logs and ship manifests show that a crew of 100 would consume on average around 60 to 70 gallons of rum per month. Much of it used not just for morale, but to numb pain during injuries. Not exactly a scientific dosage, but it worked well enough for some. Picture a surgeon pouring rum over a cracked rib while the poor mate screams and thrashes, likely making the whole operation more chaotic but slightly more bearable. Another hilarious yet terrible approach was using makeshift tourniquets, often a belt, rope, or even a leather strap to control bleeding. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. Improvised tourniquets regularly resulted in more damage by cutting off circulation for too long, sometimes causing limbs to blacken and rot, which forced pirates to amputate more than they might have otherwise. That being said, amputation was one of the surprisingly effective strategies. Believe it or not, in some pirate ships, amputation survival rates could approach 70% because it was the cleanest way to stop infection from spreading. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most notorious pirates of the early 18th century, reportedly insisted on early amputations during fights. His surgeons used bone saws salvaged from carpenter shops and linen strips boiled in seawater as bandages. Speaking of bandages, pirates had their own versions, often using rough linen or old canvas torn from sails soaked in herbal concoctions. You can imagine the smell, a mixture of rancid sailcloth and whatever herbs they could grab from ports like marjoram or sage. These plants actually contained natural antiseptics, though the pirates likely thought of them as more superstition than medicine. And here's the thing, this folk medicine approach actually helped. Herbal antiseptics slow bacterial growth, and when paired with diligent wound cleaning, some pirates survived vicious injuries better than unlucky sailors aboard better-equipped naval ships where surgery was delayed. Now in the field of wound closure, pirates had hilarious failures. Before the advent of surgical sutures as we know them, they tried stitching wounds with just about anything, fish guts, thin wires, or even strands of hemp rope. Spoiler alert, it didn't work well. These crude stitches often broke loose mid-fight, causing wounds to reopen amid the chaos. One famous anecdote recounts a pirate known as Calico Jack, whose ship's doctor tried to stitch a gash across his forearm using a brittle piece of rigging rope. Let's just say the rope frayed instantly, leaving the wound gaping. Talk about adding insult to injury. But the real genius was the use of catgut sutures, which pirates accidentally discovered through trial and error. Catgut, made from the intestines of sheep or goats, not cats despite the name, would soon become the surgical thread of choice because it was absorbable and less likely to cause infection. Pirates didn't invent catgut, but their practices and desperate innovations helped push its use from butchers and leather workers into rough medical settings. It was basically pirate innovation meets medieval medicine. Of course, controlling infection was the real battle. Without antibiotics, infections from wounds like gangrene and tetanus were often death sentences. Pirates had to improvise, often resorting to burning infected tissue, a technique called cauterization, where a hot iron or even a red-hot blade was applied directly to the wound to burn away the rot. Sounds insane. That's because it was, and you can bet sailors weren't exactly thrilled to go through it. But this brutal method stopped many infections from spreading and saved lives. The downside was the horrific pain and sometimes additional tissue damage. One documented case comes from the notorious pirate Blackbeard himself. During a skirmish off the coast of North Carolina in 1718, one of his crew suffered a deep cut on the leg. The ship's doctor heated a metal poker until it was red hot and pressed it into the wound to stop the infection. The poor sailor reportedly screamed louder than the cannons firing, and to add insult to injury, his leg ended up looking like a burnt chimney. Still, the procedure was 70% effective in preventing fatal infection, which in pirate surgery terms meant the difference between walking the plank or living to pillage another day. Now, diagnosis itself was a challenge. Without stethoscopes or x-rays, pirate surgeons had to rely on what they could see and feel, often with the patient bleeding, moaning, and swaying on a rolling deck. Broken ribs might be mistaken for bruises, and internal injuries. Forget about it. This lack of technology meant many injuries went untreated or were misdiagnosed, leading to hilarious or tragic consequences. One amusing story from pirate lore involves a crewman who complained of stomach pain after a heavy meal of salted pork and ship's biscuits. The surgeon, thinking it was a minor boil, sliced into the man's side, only to realize the problem was just bad indigestion. Talk about unnecessary drama and an embarrassing trip to the afterlife. If the patient hadn't been lucky, the solution here, believe it or not, was often rest and a change of diet, something pirates were notoriously bad at. So despite their rough and ready approaches, some surgeons doubled as nutritionists, pushing crews to eat more fresh fruit when docked, when available, to stave off scurvy, which was itself a massive killer at sea. Interestingly, the connection between vitamin C deficiency and scurvy was unknown in pirate times, so their approach was mostly trial and error, or just a good excuse for lots of lemon-flavored rum. But let's not forget hygiene, or the astounding lack of it, which compounded the risk of infection. Ships reeked of sweat, unwashed bodies, sea salt, and worst of all, the occasional rat stew served accidentally. Pirates tried to maintain what passed for cleanliness by scrubbing decks, and sometimes cutting crew's hair short to reduce lice. But surgical wounds often became playgrounds for microbes. Head lice infestations were common, leading to scratching that spread bacteria from skin to skin. Pirates knew this was bad, but the remedy, drenching the crew in seawater or burning infested clothes, was patchy at best. Still, they caught on that clean bandages and keeping wounds uncovered during the day helped air out infections, an early nod towards modern wound care. It's pretty impressive that these salty sea dogs, who sometimes looked like walking garbage bins, managed to balance all this cacophony of disaster with actual survival. The shanties sung at night by firelight likely covered not just tales of treasure and terror, but whispered prayers for healing and sanity after bloody deck battles. Remarkably, some pirate crews survived multi-day battles with no medical deaths, solely based on the quick improvisation and brutal effectiveness of their makeshift surgeons. Of course, that doesn't mean everybody walked away in one piece. In fact, many pirates carried gruesome scars and amputated limbs, their fearsome appearances partially a result of battlefield medicine that was part miracle, part nightmare. Yet these rough patchwork medical solutions not only kept pirate ships afloat, but also offered early glimpses into the evolving art of battlefield surgery. So next time you watch a swashbuckling pirate movie and see the surgeon calmly stitching a clean wound with silk thread under candlelight, just remember, real pirate surgery was much messier, smelled worse, and involved far too much rum. And well, the whole procedure was probably less savvy medical professional, and more, let's hope this doesn't kill you before the cannonballs do. Now, if you think that's shocking, wait till you hear about the specific herbs, rituals, and completely bonkers methods pirates used to manage blood loss and infection in Part 2, coming right up. Alright, so now that we know pirates were basically performing battlefield surgeries with whatever sharp thing they could scrounge up, rinsing wounds in seawater, pouring rum on everything like it was liquid magic, and sawing off limbs with carpenter's tools, you might wonder, how did they actually stop the bleeding and deal with infections beyond just hoping for the best? Buckle up, because when it comes to managing blood loss and infection, pirates were equal parts trial and error scientists and desperate chaos coordinators on board those creaky wooden death traps. Blood loss was the real silent killer. Picture a pirate with an artery spurting like a busted water pipe on a stormy night, and the closest thing to a tourniquet is your captain's belt or maybe a scrap of rope from the rigging. Bad idea? Absolutely. Let me paint you a scene. During a nasty skirmish in the Caribbean around 1720, Black Sam Bellamy's crew suffered severe injuries after boarding a Spanish merchant ship. One unlucky fellow got sliced across the thigh by a cutlass, and they tried jamming a rolled-up canvas tied tight with leather strips to stop the bleeding. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The makeshift tourniquet was so tight it cut off circulation, turning the poor guy's leg into a blue, numb mess, forcing the surgeon, who doubled as the ship's carpenter, to amputate above the knee using a saw intended for planks. Not pretty, right? But here's where pirates got surprisingly clever. They realized that a tourniquet only helped if you didn't leave it on forever. Too long and, well, gangrene would set in fast, making things worse than the original injury. Without modern clocks or timers, they timed tourniquets by counting shanty verses or the number of swigs of rum, which wasn't exactly reliable, but hey, better than nothing. Their real genius was inventing a sort of pressure dressing, using layers of linen soaked in vinegar or a mix of herbs like lavender and thyme. These plants weren't chosen randomly, but because locals in port towns swore by their healing properties. Pirates didn't know about bacteria, but they knew these herbal concoctions prevented wounds from getting weepy and slowed infections, kind of like the 17th century equivalent of antibiotic ointment. One hilarious side effect: those vinegar-soaked bandages smelled about as pleasant as a sea monster's toenail fungus, and pirates constantly complained that after battle, the entire ship reeked like a floating herbal pharmacy gone wrong. But the upside: infection rates dropped enough to increase survival by about 30%, which for pirates was basically a miracle. Now, here's the kicker. Pirates also stumbled upon cauterization, that brutal old-school trick where you burn a wound shut before you say ouch. Understand this was often the only thing stopping infection faster than pirates could say, "Shiver me timbers." They'd heat an iron rod until it blazed red and press it directly into the wound, sealing exposed flesh with what we can only describe as flaming agony. Trust me, being burned alive isn't the same as dying of infection. A famous example involves the ill-fated ship Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's flagship, where the ship's surgeon reportedly cauterized a severe neck wound during battle. The poor sailor screamed louder than the cannons, and afterward the burned flesh took on a sort of charred look that made him look like a human chimney. Talk about ruining your swagger. Oddly enough though, it was roughly 70% effective at preventing deadly infections, so in pirate logic that was a win, even if it cost the poor soul their cool factor. Moving on, pirates fought another nightmare, scurvy. This vitamin C deficiency disease was basically turning whole crews into walking zombies with bleeding gums, swollen joints, and a deadly propensity for collapsing on deck. Now, contrary to popular myth, pirates weren't entirely clueless about scurvy. They noticed that crews who managed some fresh fruit or vegetables during port calls did better, even if they didn't know it was the vitamin C doing the heavy lifting. Captain James Cook famously mandated fresh citrus during his lengthy voyages, influencing pirate crews to at least try grabbing lemons or limes when they could. But because pirates were, well, pirates, fresh produce was a luxury, and the majority of the time they subsisted on hardtack and salted pork. Foods about as helpful against scurvy as a bucket of salt water is for cleaning a wound. To compensate, they often dipped their grog rations into citrus juices or mixed crushed herbs into their meals, both for flavor and what they hoped was medicinal effect. This patchy and inconsistent diet meant scurvy sometimes wiped out more pirates than cannonballs. Talk about a grim reaper hiding in the pantry. Of course, pirates weren't famous for stellar hygiene, which made infection control an uphill battle. Ships were overcrowded, sweaty, rat-infested floating hellholes with barely any fresh water for washing. And personal cleanliness wasn't a priority when you're more concerned about who's got the most cannonballs. Pirates tried scrubbing decks relentlessly with seawater to keep rats and lice at bay, and sometimes attempted makeshift flea baths by dumping buckets of vinegar or seawater over the crew. Spoiler alert, it didn't always work, and head lice and scabies outbreaks were as common as loose cannons during a wild board. The consequences got ugly fast. Itching from lice caused open sores, which turned into perfect breeding grounds for bacteria, ramping up infection rates and prolonging recoveries. Pirates got desperate, resorting to burning infested clothes or even shaving off their hair in patches to get rid of the problem. So yeah, pirates looked tough, but many of them walked around with patchy hair and gross skin infections under those fearsome hats. It's pretty funny to imagine a group of ruthless buccaneers with bald spots and scabby heads trying to look intimidating. But hey, if it kept them alive, who cares about vanity? Now let's talk about one of the craziest surgical tools pirate surgeons accidentally popularized, the catgut suture. Before modern threads, closing wounds was an art of madness. Pirates tried stitching wounds with everything from fish guts, yep, literally the intestines of fish, to thin strips of hemp rope. Bad idea, you bet. These makeshift stitches often unraveled mid-battle, reopening what should have been healing wounds and causing more bloodshed and groaning. But pirates noticed that when they used intestines from goats or sheep, the stitches actually held better and dissolved over time instead of needing removal. A total game changer. They didn't know it then, but catgut is absorbable and reduces infection risk by not keeping foreign material stuck in the wound. Talk about a lucky accident born of necessity and pure desperation. Over time, this cobbled-together technique made pirate surgery more effective than many naval surgeons using more conventional, but less practical, materials. Now, the final piece of this gruesome puzzle was post-surgery care. Pirates couldn't afford to have wounded crews bedridden below decks for weeks during a battle or long voyage. So bedside nursing became a group effort. Mates would take turns cleaning wounds with seawater, changing those vinegar-soaked bandages, and sometimes even chanting prayerful shanties to keep spirits up. This rough bedside manner was probably less comforting than a modern hospital, but remarkably effective for keeping survivors from succumbing to infection or sheer despair. Pirates also experimented with laying injured sailors in hammocks near open air to let the wounds breathe, an early form of wound aeration that actually helped dry out infections and boost healing, a method ship's surgeons elsewhere only started adopting decades later. It's surprisingly sophisticated when you think about it. Bunch of outlaws on tiny ships inventing battlefield medicine that would influence naval practice for years afterward. So, what's the takeaway here? Pirates were a mess, a bloody, smelly, drunk, and occasionally terrifying mess, but they were also inventive survivors. They faced impossible odds without the benefits of antiseptics, anesthesia, or cleanliness, yet developed improvisations that, consciously or not, embraced principles we only understood centuries later. Their seawater rinses, herbal dressings, cautious use of tourniquets, brutal but life-saving cauterizations, accidental adoption of catgut sutures, and rudimentary nursing all contributed to keeping a violent, often injured crew afloat and fighting another day. And here's the ironic twist. The very same pirate surgeons who seemed like madmen wielding rusty knives on rolling decks actually helped lay the groundwork for future battlefield medicine. So next time you watch a pirate movie and see a surgeon calmly stitching a neat, clean wound by candlelight in a nice little cabin, remember the real deal was way messier, smelled way worse, involved way more screaming, and perhaps most importantly, was full of bizarre little inventions brewed in the chaos of battle and driven by necessity, rum, and sheer stubbornness. Because if pirates had one thing in common beyond the treasure and terror, it was this: a relentless, if barbaric, hunger to survive against all odds, even if that meant hacking off a limb or burning flesh with a red-hot poker right there in the fray. That's pirate surgery for you, gritty, gutsy, and gloriously grim.